Hey guys. Tonight we're going to do that thing where you dim the lights, lower the volume just a little, and let history slowly wander past like it's wearing slippers and carrying a lukewarm cup of tea. No yelling. No dramatic music. Just vibes. So settle in. Get comfortable. And let's gently unravel the real story behind the Great Wall of China, which, spoiler alert, was not built in one go, not built by one emperor with a single vision, and definitely not built because someone said, "Wouldn't this look nice from space?" That part came much later. And it's wrong anyway. Now, when most people imagine the Great Wall, they picture that very specific stretch of stone snaking over green hills, usually photographed at sunrise, usually empty, usually implying peace, order, and architectural competence. That version mostly belongs to the Ming dynasty. And we'll get there. Slowly. Very slowly. But before it was stone and tourism and tasteful Instagram angles, the Great Wall was kind of a mess. A very long, very expensive, very exhausting mess. And it starts, as many historical disasters do, with one man who absolutely refused to relax. Enter Qin Shi Huang. He was the first emperor of a unified China, which sounds impressive, and but it also meant he had the stress level of someone managing 40 group chats at once, all of them arguing. Before him, China wasn't one neat empire. It was a collection of warring states, constantly fighting, constantly betraying each other, and constantly inventing new ways to be exhausting. Qin Shi Huang looked at this chaos and said essentially, "No, we're done with that." So he conquered everyone. 'Cause of course he did. Once he unified the land, he standardized writing, currency, weights, measurements, and even the width of cart axles. Which is a level of micromanagement that suggests he absolutely would have been unbearable at dinner parties. But his biggest obsession wasn't organization. It was control. Specifically, control over who was allowed to come in. And who needed to stay very, very far out. To the north lived various nomadic groups, loosely referred to as the Xiongnu. They were mobile, fast, and had a deeply annoying habit of not respecting borders, treaties, or Qin Shi Huang's personal sense of order. They rode horses. They raided. They left before anyone could organize a proper response. And Qin Shi Huang hated that. He wanted something solid. Something permanent. Something that said, "This side is mine. That side is chaos." So he ordered walls. Not one wall. Multiple walls. Here's the part people often miss. Qin Shi Huang did not invent the idea of border walls. The earlier states had already built regional defenses, rammed earth walls, wooden fortifications, trenches. Qin Shi Huang simply connected them, expanded them, and slapped his imperial authority on top like a very aggressive label. This early Great Wall was not stone. It was dirt. Compressed earth. Layered and tamped down until it hardened into something that could vaguely stop people who were already halfway through. It stretched across mountains, deserts, and places where no one in their right mind wanted to work. Which is why the people building it were not volunteers. They were soldiers. They were peasants. They were prisoners. And they were very tired. Labor on the wall was brutal. People worked in extreme heat and freezing cold. Supplies were inconsistent. Injuries were common. Death was not unusual. There's a reason later legends would claim bodies were buried inside the wall itself, which isn't literally true, but emotionally accurate enough that people kept repeating it for centuries. Qin Shi Huang, meanwhile, was not on site offering encouragement. He was busy doing other emperor things like burning books, executing scholars, and obsessively searching for immortality. Immortality. While thousands of workers were dying to keep invaders out, Qin Shi Huang was sending expeditions to find magical elixirs that would let him live forever. Many of those elixirs contained mercury, which explains a lot. The wall, under Qin, wasn't really a single continuous structure. It was a series of defensive lines, watchtowers, and barriers meant to slow down raids, not stop them entirely. Think less impenetrable fortress, and more very long speed bump. And it worked, sometimes. But Qin Shi Huang's dynasty didn't last. He died in 210 BCE, possibly from mercury poisoning, which feels on brand. His empire collapsed almost immediately after. The wall didn't save it. Walls rarely save regimes. Which brings us gently drifting into the Han dynasty. The Han inherited both the empire and its anxiety about the northern frontier. They looked at the existing walls and said, "Okay, but what if we made them longer?" So they did. The Han dynasty expanded the wall westward, deep into what is now the Gobi Desert. This wasn't just about defense. It was about trade. Specifically the Silk Road. The wall under the Han wasn't just a barrier. It was a border system. Watchtowers doubled as signal stations. Smoke by day, fire by night. One puff means something minor. Several puffs means please panic politely. These walls helped protect caravans, regulate movement, and remind everyone exactly where imperial authority ended, and where chaos politely began. Still the construction was harsh. Still laborers suffered. Still the wall was porous. Nomadic groups didn't disappear just because someone stacked dirt really high. They adapted. They negotiated. Sometimes they just went around. And over time the wall began to decay. Because walls, like empires, require maintenance. And maintenance is boring. After the Han, China went through periods of division. Dynasties rose and fell. Some repaired sections of the wall. Others ignored it entirely. A few even actively dismantled parts to reuse the materials, which is the ancient equivalent of saying, "We're not doing this anymore." For centuries, the wall existed in fragments. Symbolic. Functional in places. Forgotten in others. It wasn't until much later, over 1,000 years later, that the Great Wall would become the version most people recognize today. But before we get there, it's worth pausing on one important thing. The Great Wall was never just a wall. It was a policy, mindset, a physical expression of fear, control, and exhaustion. Every dynasty that touched it was responding to the same question. How do you manage a border when your neighbors don't share your definition of borders? Some answered with diplomacy, some with tribute, some with war, and some repeatedly with more wall. Let's gently drift forward now. Past collapsed dynasties. Past crumbling earthworks. Past long stretches where the wall was more memory than structure. Eventually, we arrive at the Ming dynasty. And this is where the wall gets serious. The Ming had been burned before. Literally. They came to power after overthrowing the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, which meant they were deeply aware of what happened when northern powers were not taken seriously. The Ming did not want another Mongol situation. They wanted security, and they had resources, so they rebuilt the wall. This time with stone and brick. This time with uniform watchtowers. This time with an aesthetic that quietly says, "We learned our lesson." The Ming wall is tall, wide, and solid. Follows ridgelines. It integrates fortresses. It's designed not just to delay invaders, but to dominate the landscape. This is the wall people photograph. This is the wall people hike. This is the wall that looks eternal. But even the Ming wall was not invincible. It didn't stop all invasions. It didn't prevent internal collapse. Because no wall can fix corruption, or famine, or court politics that spiral quietly out of control. In the end, the Ming fell too. And the wall once again became something else. Relic. Symbol. A story people told themselves about strength and unity. So when we talk about the Great Wall of China today, we're not really talking about one structure. We're talking about over 2,000 years of effort, anxiety, ambition, and very sore backs. It's not a monument to isolation. It's a monument to persistence. And to the idea that when faced with uncertainty, humans often choose the most physically exhausting solution available, and then keep rebuilding it for centuries. Let's rest here for a moment. Let the dust settle. Because next we're going to float into the myths, the exaggerations, the you can see it from space era, and the strange afterlife of a wall that never quite did what it was supposed to do, but became legendary anyway. Part 2. Myths, Misunderstandings, and the Wall That Refused to Retire. Alright, welcome back. If you drifted off a little during the last part, that's perfect. That means it's working. So let's gently pick ourselves up from the Ming dynasty, standing on a very sturdy, very expensive stone wall, and talk about what happened next. Because the Great Wall, despite all expectations, did not gracefully exit history after doing its job. Instead, it lingered, quietly, awkwardly, like a retired official who keeps showing up to meetings uninvited. Now, the Ming dynasty believed very strongly in this wall. They poured resources into it. Labor, axes, brick after brick after brick. And for a while it worked, kind of. Raids were slowed. Signals traveled fast. The border felt controlled. But here's the thing no one building a wall ever likes to admit. Walls only work if the people guarding the gates are having a good day. And eventually, someone always has a bad day. In 1644, the Ming dynasty collapsed. Not because the wall crumbled, but because politics did. Factional infighting, corruption, economic stress, famine. The usual slow, boring stuff that actually ends empires. A rebel leader named Li Zicheng marched into Beijing. The last Ming emperor panicked and hanged himself, which is not ideal for morale. And then, the gates were opened. Literally. A Ming general guarding the Shanhai Pass, one of the most critical gateways through the Great Wall, made a decision. Faced with rebellion on one side and Manchu forces on the other, he chose what he thought was the lesser evil. He opened the gates to the Manchus. And just like that, the Great Wall didn't fail. It was politely bypassed. The Manchus went on to establish the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China. And here's where things get interesting. The Qing did not care much about the Great Wall. This wasn't negligence. It was strategy. The Qing were originally from beyond the wall. To them, the wall wasn't a proud symbol of civilization. It was a reminder that someone had once tried to keep them out. Now they were in charge. So instead of reinforcing the wall, the Qing expanded northward. They absorbed territory. They ruled a multi-ethnic empire that included Manchus, Mongols, Tibetans, and others. Borders became flexible again. Defense shifted from walls to diplomacy, banners, and military presence. The wall faded into the background. Sections collapsed. Bricks were stolen for houses. Earth walls eroded back into hills. For a long time the Great Wall was just there. A very long ruin that farmers lived beside, children climbed on, and no one particularly romanticized. That romanticizing came later, much later. Fast forward to the 19th and early 20th centuries. China is under pressure from foreign powers. Empires are circling. Internal rebellions flare up. The old imperial system collapses in 1911. Suddenly the past matters again. The Great Wall begins to transform, not physically but symbolically. Becomes a metaphor, a reminder of endurance, of unity, of resistance. And this is where the myths really start to grow legs. Let's talk about the biggest one. No, you cannot see the Great Wall from space. This idea refuses to die, mostly because it sounds impressive and feels true. But astronauts have repeatedly confirmed that the wall is not visible to the naked eye from orbit under normal conditions. It's long, yes, but it's also narrow and blends into the landscape. Rivers are easier to spot. Cities glow. Walls, not so much. But the myth stuck because it says something people like. That human effort can leave a mark so large it transcends Earth itself. Even if that mark is mostly dirt and bricks held together by sticky rice mortar. Sticky rice mortar. That part is true. The Ming used a mixture of lime and glutinous rice to strengthen their walls. And it worked remarkably well. Some sections are still standing centuries later, stubbornly refusing to collapse out of sheer culinary chemistry. Which means, in a way, the Great Wall is partially a rice-based structure. History is beautiful like that. Now let's drift into the human cost again, because the wall always comes back to that. Legends say millions died building it. That exact number is debated, but what's clear is that countless laborers were conscripted across dynasties. Soldiers rotated in. Peasants were drafted. Criminals were sentenced to wall duty. For many, it was a one-way assignment. Families were separated. Villages lost working-age men. Graves appeared along the route. And out of this suffering came stories. Ghost stories. Folk songs. Tragic ballads about wives searching endlessly for husbands who never returned. The most famous is the legend of Meng, whose tears supposedly caused a section of the wall to collapse, revealing her husband's bones. Is it historically accurate? No. Is it emotionally accurate? Absolutely. The wall became a canvas for grief. A place where people projected loss, frustration, and the quiet rage of being ordered to sacrifice for something abstract. And yet, the wall endured. By the time the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, the Great Wall was already a symbol. The new government leaned into it. Restoration projects began. Certain sections were preserved. Others were left to decay naturally. And slowly the wall transformed again. From defense, to ruin, to national monument, to tourist destination. Today millions visit every year. They climb restored steps, take photos, buy souvenirs shaped like tiny bricks. And most of them walk on the Ming Wall, the late version, the polished version, the one that hides the messy layers beneath. Few realize they're walking atop centuries of anxiety, of trial and error, of rulers who believed walls could solve human complexity. And that brings us to the real story behind the Great Wall. It wasn't built to keep everyone out. It didn't unify China. It didn't guarantee safety. What it did was reflect the mindset of those who built it. Fear of the unknown, desire for control, faith in physical solutions to political problems. Each dynasty added its own layer, sometimes literally, trying to fix the same issue with the same basic idea. just executed slightly differently. And in that way, the Great Wall is deeply human. It's ambitious. It's flawed. It's exhausting. It stands not because it always worked, but because people kept believing that this time it would. So as we slowly move forward, letting the wall stretch behind us into mist and memory, we're going to look next at the people who lived near it. The soldiers stationed there for years. The families on the frontier. The quiet, repetitive lives spent staring north, waiting for something that might never come. No battles. No drama. Just long stretches of wind, boredom, and routine. And honestly, that might be the most accurate Great Wall story of all. Part 3. Life on the Wall, or How to be Bored in the Most Strategic Place on Earth. Alright, welcome back again. If you're still with me, excellent. If you drifted off and woke up confused but calm, even better. That's exactly the Great Wall experience. So now that we've talked about emperors, dynasties, collapses, and myths that refuse to retire, let's gently slide sideways and talk about the people who actually lived with the wall. Not the rulers who ordered it built. Not the poets who wrote about it centuries later. The regular people. The garrison soldiers. The families on the frontier. The ones whose lives were defined by long stretches of absolutely nothing happening. Because here's a quiet truth about the Great Wall. Most of the time it was boring. Not dramatic. Not heroic. Just repetitive. Imagine being a soldier stationed on the wall during the Ming dynasty. You're not in a glamorous capital city. You're not near court politics or festivals or exciting scandals. You're on a windswept ridge, surrounded by stone, dirt, and other men who smell exactly like you do. Your job is to watch the horizon. Every day. You wake up early. You check your equipment. You patrol your assigned section. You climb stairs that never end. You stare north. You see grass. Maybe hills. Maybe snow. Maybe dust. Usually nothing moves. Sometimes a bird. Sometimes another soldier who also looks tired. This was not an elite posting. Frontier service was often assigned as punishment, or at least as an obligation no one was thrilled about. Supplies could be irregular. Pay might be late. Winters were brutal. Summers were dry and relentless. And yet, life continued. Soldiers cooked. They gambled. They complained. They wrote letters home that took weeks or months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Some brought families. Small communities grew near forts and passes. Children were born within sight of the wall. They grew up climbing it. To them, it wasn't a symbol. It was just there. Many soldiers spent years without seeing combat. The wall functioned as a deterrent more than a battlefield. Its presence said, "This is watched." And often that was enough. But the waiting took a toll. Historical records mention desertion, low morale, alcohol consumption that was probably higher than officially acknowledged. There's something deeply draining about being constantly on alert for a threat that may never arrive. The wall didn't just block enemies. Block time. Days blurred together. Seasons changed slowly. The same repairs had to be made again and again. Bricks cracked. Mortar loosened. Earth eroded. Fix it. Patch it. Move on. And if something did happen, a raid, a skirmish, it was often fast and chaotic. Nomadic groups were skilled at hit-and-run tactics. They didn't line up politely in front of the wall and announce their intentions. They tested weak points. They bribed guards. They slipped through passes. Which brings us back to that uncomfortable truth. Walls don't work alone. They rely on people. And people get tired. People get hungry. People make decisions that seem reasonable at the time and catastrophic later. Over centuries, entire economies developed around the wall. Border trade flourished at designated markets. Goods moved in controlled ways. Horses, grain, silk, salt. The wall wasn't just a military structure. It was a regulator of life. Who could travel, where, and under what conditions? For some frontier families, the wall meant stability, protection, sense of order. For others, it meant restriction, surveillance, a constant reminder of imperial authority pressing down from very far away. And then there were the cultural divides. The wall didn't separate civilization from barbarism, despite how it's often framed. It separated different ways of life. Sedentary agriculture on one side, nomadic pastoralism on the other. These worlds interacted constantly, through trade, intermarriage, conflict, and diplomacy. The wall didn't stop that, just shaped it. Now let's gently move forward again, because eventually, the wall stopped being a lived-in space and became something quieter. Ruin. As dynasties fell and priorities shifted, soldiers left, garrisons shrank, villages moved, nature crept back in. Grass grew between stones. Watchtowers collapsed inward like tired old men sitting down too fast. By the time Western travelers began describing the wall in the 17th and 18th centuries, many sections were already crumbling. And yet, these travelers wrote about it with awe. They saw scale. They saw antiquity. They saw meaning. Even as locals walked past it without a second glance. And this is how monuments are born. Not when they're useful, but when they're no longer needed. The Great Wall slowly shifted from infrastructure to imagination. It became a canvas for national identity, foreign fascination, and historical storytelling. Poets wrote about it. Painters framed it against dramatic skies. Later, photographers waited patiently for fog and golden light. And through all of this, the wall stayed silent. It didn't explain itself. It didn't correct misunderstandings. It just stood there, uneven and persistent. Which brings us gently toward the modern era, where the Great Wall becomes something else entirely. Destination, lesson, brand. Next, we're going to float into how the wall was rediscovered, restored, and repackaged in the 20th century. How certain sections were chosen to represent thousands of miles of complexity. And how a structure built to divide slowly became something meant to bring people in. So take a breath. Let the wind pass over the stones. Part 4. From forgotten ruin to national icon, because history loves a rebrand. Alright, welcome back. We're still moving at a nice, gentle pace. Nothing sudden. Nothing loud. Just history slowly stretching and yawning. By the early 20th century, the Great Wall had reached an odd phase of its life. It wasn't defending anything anymore. It wasn't staffed. It wasn't even consistently respected. In many places it was simply in the way. Farmers reused bricks. Villagers dismantled sections for homes. Paths cut straight through it. And no one thought this was strange. After all, for centuries the wall had been practical infrastructure. When infrastructure stops being useful, people recycle it. That's just efficiency wearing historical amnesia. But then China entered one of its most turbulent periods. The Qing dynasty fell. Warlords took over. Foreign powers interfered. Revolutions brewed. And in moments like this, nations tend to look backward, searching for something solid, something old, something that feels permanent even if it never really was. That's when the Great Wall slowly started becoming important again. Not militarily, symbolically. Chinese intellectuals and reformers began reframing the wall as evidence of endurance, of continuity, of survival against external pressure. The narrative shifted from border defense experiment to eternal symbol of the Chinese people. This shift accelerated after 1949, when the People's Republic of China was established. The new government needed symbols. Big ones. Ones that suggested longevity, unity, and historical depth. And the Great Wall was just sitting there, quietly volunteering. One famous line often attributed to Mao Zedong goes something like, "He who has never been to the Great Wall is not a true man," which is motivational, sure, but also slightly passive-aggressive. Suddenly, the wall wasn't just old rubble. It was a rite of passage. Restoration projects began, especially near Beijing. Not the whole wall, that would be impossible, but select sections. Carefully chosen ones. Accessible ones. Scenic ones. The kind that photograph well. Beidling became the star. Smooth steps. Reinforced towers. Guardrails. It was less ancient hardship and more historical theme park with stairs. And this wasn't deception. It was curation. The reality is that much of the Great Wall is fragile. Earth walls crumble if you look at them too hard. Remote sections can't handle mass tourism. Restoration often means rebuilding, sometimes with modern materials, which raises complicated questions about authenticity. But authenticity is a flexible thing. What matters is what people feel when they stand on the wall. And standing there, looking out over ridges and valleys, it's easy to feel small. To feel history pressing in gently from all sides. Even if the bricks beneath your feet were replaced last Tuesday. The wall became a stage for state visits. World leaders posed for photos. School textbooks emphasized it. Films framed it dramatically. The wall entered the global imagination not as a series of messy, inconsistent defenses, but as a single unified achievement. Which again it never was. But that's not the point anymore. Now let's drift into a quieter detail that often gets overlooked. Preservation versus reality. Most of the Great Wall, over 70%, is in poor condition. Erosion. Looting. Weather. Time doing what time does best. Some sections have vanished entirely. Others are barely distinguishable from natural ridgelines. And yet, that's still the Great Wall. Not just the restored postcard version. Not just the tourist-friendly stretches. But the broken ones too. The wall that collapses back into the earth. The wall that disappears. Because history doesn't preserve itself evenly. Preserves what people choose to save. There's also something quietly ironic about this phase of the wall's life. It was built to control movement. To regulate who entered and who didn't. And now, its primary function is to attract movement. Millions of visitors. Cameras. Step. Souvenir stands. It went from exclusion to invitation, from fear to pride, from keep out to please stay on the path. And all of this happened without the wall ever changing its mind. It didn't choose to be symbolic, just outlasted everything else. As we ease toward the final stretches of our story, we're going to talk about the Great Wall not as a structure, but as an idea. How it's been used, reused, misunderstood, and quietly simplified. Because the real story behind the Great Wall of China isn't about bricks or battles. It's about how humans remember. and how they reshape the past until it feels comforting enough to stand on. So take another breath. Let your eyes rest. In the next part, we'll gently wrap things up, not with a grand conclusion, but with a slow reflection on why walls, even failed ones, keep showing up in history again and again. Part 5. Why humans keep building walls, even after all the evidence. Alright, last stretch. No big finale. No dramatic reveal. Just a slow walk toward the end, like leaving a museum slightly tired, slightly thoughtful, and ready for a nap. By now, the Great Wall has done more than enough. It's been a border, a workplace, a ruin, a metaphor, a photo backdrop, and a national symbol. It has survived emperors, invasions, neglect, reinvention, and millions of footsteps from people wearing wildly inappropriate shoes. And yet, the most interesting thing about the Great Wall isn't how long it is, or how old it is, or how many dynasties touched it. It's how familiar it feels. Because once you strip away the bricks and legends, the Great Wall is really about a very human impulse. The desire to draw a line and believe that the line will solve something. For Qin Shi Huang, the wall was about control. He had unified a fractured world and wanted it to stay unified, preferably forever. He trusted systems, standards, and physical barriers more than people, which, to be fair, is a mindset that still exists. For the Han Dynasty, the wall was about management, trade routes, influence, risk reduction, not isolation but regulation. The wall wasn't saying, no one passes. It was saying, pass correctly. For the Ming, the wall was about trauma. They remembered what happened when northern powers weren't contained. Their wall was taller, stronger, and more confident. It projected certainty in a time that didn't feel very certain at all. And for modern China, the wall is about memory. About choosing which version of the past to preserve. About finding continuity in a history that includes collapse, division, and reinvention. Each era saw the wall differently. Each used it for what they needed. And none of them were completely wrong. The Great Wall didn't fail because it was pointless. It failed when it failed because it was asked to do too much. It was expected to replace diplomacy, adaptability, and political stability with stone and earth. That's a lot to ask of a wall. What's fascinating is how rarely this lesson sticks. Across history, walls keep appearing. Physical ones, legal ones, cultural ones. They're built with confidence, urgency, and the belief that this time it will be different. Sometimes they work for a while. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they become symbols instead of solutions. And that's exactly what happened here. The Great Wall didn't create China. It didn't define China. But it did reflect it. Its anxieties, its ambitions, its endurance. It stretches across landscapes that barely notice it anymore. Mountains rise higher. Deserts shift. Weather wears it down grain by grain. And still pieces remain. Not because they're indestructible, but because people keep deciding they matter. That decision is the real story. Not the myth of invincibility. Not the fantasy of perfect defense. But the quiet agreement, generation after generation, to keep pointing at this long, uneven line and say, this means something. And maybe that's enough. So as we gently step off the wall and let it fade back into the dark, remember this. The Great Wall of China is not a warning or a triumph. It's a record of effort, of fear, of persistence, of humans doing what humans have always done, trying to make the world feel a little more manageable, one brick at a time. And on that very calm, slightly dusty note, you can let your eyes close now. History will still be here in the morning. Part 6. The wall after midnight, or what happens when the tour buses leave. Alright, we can keep going. History doesn't mind. It's very patient. So imagine it's late. The souvenir stalls are closed. The last group photo has been taken. The tour buses pull away in a cloud of polite dust. And the Great Wall is left alone again, which is how it spent most of its life anyway. This is the version of the wall that rarely makes it into documentaries. No speeches. No flags. No carefully framed angles. Just stone cooling in the night air. In places like Badaling Great Wall, the wall is reinforced, curated, watched. But beyond those stretches, far from the main roads, the wall becomes something quieter. Depths uneven. Towers broken open. Earth walls slumping back into the hills like they've decided they're done pretending to be architecture. And this is where the wall feels the most honest. Because when no one is asking it to symbolize anything, it finally gets to just exist. Over the centuries, people have projected all kinds of meaning onto it. Strength, isolation, unity, resistance, endurance. And the wall has politely accepted all of it without ever confirming or denying a thing. Doesn't argue. It doesn't clarify. Just keeps being long. What's interesting is how little the wall cares about borders now. Modern boundaries don't follow it neatly. Nations changed. Maps were redrawn. The wall didn't move to keep up. It stayed exactly where it was, marking anxieties that no longer quite apply. In that way, it's a fossil of fear. Not fear in a dramatic sense. Not panic. Just that low-level, persistent worry that something might come from the other side if you're not careful enough. That if you don't build something, you're being irresponsible. That feeling is timeless. Which is probably why the Great Wall still resonates. Even with people who don't know the dynasties. Even with people who don't remember dates. Even with people who just came because it was on a list. Standing on the wall, it's easy to feel the scale of effort. Harder to feel the outcome. Did it work? Sometimes. Did it fail? Also sometimes. But mostly, it just absorbed labor and time and left behind a line in the landscape. And maybe that's the most realistic legacy any massive project can hope for. There's a temptation when talking about something this old, to wrap it up neatly, to give it a moral, to say, and therefore we should learn X. But the Great Wall resists that. It wasn't one decision. It wasn't one mistake. It wasn't one success. It was thousands of small choices made by people reacting to immediate pressures. Invaders, politics, pride, memory, trauma, habit, and those choices piled up. Literally, brick on brick, earth on earth, century on century. If you listen closely, not literally, just emotionally, the wall doesn't sound triumphant. Sounds tired. Not defeated. Just worn. Like something that's been asked to carry too much meaning for too long. And yet, people keep coming back to it. They walk it. They touch it. They take photos of their hands resting on stone shaped by someone who never imagined smartphones or tourism, or bedtime history videos playing softly in the background. That connection, thin, quiet, and entirely unplanned, might be the wall's real accomplishment. Not defense. Not division. But continuity. So if you've stayed with me all the way out here, into this extra stretch of night, that's probably a good place to rest. The Great Wall will still be there. Uneven. Misunderstood. Endlessly repurposed. And completely indifferent to all of it. Take a breath. Let the stones fade. We've reached a very calm ending now. Part 7. the sections no one fixes, and the stories that slip through the cracks. Alright, we can drift a little further. History doesn't mind staying up late, and neither does the wall. By now, we've spent a lot of time with the idea of the Great Wall, the symbolic one, the restored one, the carefully photographed one. But there's another version that exists quietly alongside it. The parts no one repairs. The parts no one brings visiting dignitaries to. The wall that's falling apart on purpose. Far from the smooth stones of Badaling, there are stretches like Genko Great Wall. This is the wall without makeup. No guardrails. No souvenir stands. Just jagged stone clinging to steep ridges, broken towers leaning at uncomfortable angles, and staircases that politely suggest you reconsider your life choices. This is where the wall feels less like a monument and more like an old scar. These sections are officially protected, but intentionally left unrestored. Not because they're unimportant, but because fixing them would erase something. Their brokenness is the point. It shows time. It shows neglect. It shows that history doesn't stay frozen just because we admire it. And here's something strangely comforting about that. The unrestored wall doesn't pretend to be eternal. It accepts weather. It accepts gravity. It accepts that everything eventually gives in a little. When you walk along these parts, slowly, carefully, you start to notice details that rarely make it into guidebooks. Chisel marks. Crude repairs done centuries ago with whatever materials were nearby. Stones that don't quite fit because someone was rushing or tired or both. This wasn't a perfect project. It was a continuous one. And that continuity wasn't driven by grand vision alone. It was driven by habit, by precedent, by the deeply human instinct to keep doing what was done before, especially when no one can think of a better alternative. Another overlooked place is Shanhai Pass, where the wall meets the sea. This is one of the few spots where the wall has a clear beginning or end, which is oddly satisfying for something otherwise so sprawling. It was strategically crucial. It was heavily fortified. And it was also, as we mentioned earlier, a gate that once opened from the inside. That detail matters, because it reminds us that walls don't really decide anything on their own. People do. A wall can stand for centuries and still become irrelevant in a single moment of human choice. One tired general. One impossible situation. One decision that makes sense at the time. The wall remembers all of this. Not in words but in where. Some towers were never finished. Some sections were rebuilt 3 or 4 times. Some were abandoned halfway through construction when priorities changed. That incompleteness is baked in. And it makes the wall feel less like a boast and more like a work in progress that simply never stopped being one. It's also worth noting how unevenly history treats these places. One section becomes iconic. Another dissolves into a hillside. One gets funding, restoration, and school trips. Another gets goats and wind. And that's not a failure of preservation. It's an honest reflection of how memory works. We don't remember everything equally. We remember what's convenient, what's accessible, what fits the story we want to tell right now. The Great Wall contains all of its own contradictions. Strength and fragility, pride and exhaustion, order and improvisation. Doesn't resolve them, just holds them, sometimes literally, sometimes barely. As we move toward the very end of our long, quiet walk, it's worth sitting with that image. Not the wall as a triumph, not the wall as a warning, but the wall as evidence. Evidence that history is rarely clean, rarely unified, rarely finished, and somehow, still worth paying attention to. So take another slow breath. Let the unrestored stones crumble peacefully in your imagination. There's only a little more road ahead. Part 8. The Wall as a Habit, and the Comfort of Repetition. Alright, we're still here. Just a little farther, at the same unhurried pace the wall itself seems to prefer. If you step back far enough, not physically, just mentally, the Great Wall stops looking like a structure and starts looking like a habit. Reflex. A repeated response to the same quiet question asked over and over across centuries. What do we do about the North? Different dynasties answered differently, but they kept circling back to the same idea. Build, repair, extend, reinforce, and just repeat. It wasn't always confidence driving those decisions. Often it was uncertainty. And repetition is comforting when certainty is hard to find. There's something soothing about doing what's already been done, even if it didn't fully work last time. Especially if it didn't fully work last time. Because changing strategies requires admitting that the old one might be wrong. And that's a surprisingly difficult thing for empires to do. So the wall kept happening. Not as one continuous project, but as a series of quiet resumptions. A ruler looks at the frontier. Advisors shuffle papers. Someone says, "We should probably fix the wall." And everyone nods because it sounds reasonable, and because there's already a wall there to fix. No one had to invent the idea again. They just had to continue it. That continuity is part of why the Great Wall feels so ancient and so modern at the same time. It's not frozen in one era. It's layered. Each generation leaving behind just enough to shape the next one's decisions. Even decay becomes part of the cycle. A wall erodes. Someone notices. Someone repairs it partially. Another section collapses elsewhere. It's maintenance as philosophy. And this mindset didn't only affect soldiers or officials. It shaped how people thought about borders, safety, and responsibility. Living near the wall meant growing up with the assumption that protection was something solid, visible, built. You could point to it. You could walk on it. You could say, "That's what keeps us safe." Even when it didn't. Especially when it didn't. There's a gentle irony here. The wall required constant human effort to remain meaningful. Guards had to be paid. Towers had to be staffed. Signals had to be watched. Repairs had to be made. Without people, it was just a line of stone slowly returning to the landscape. And yet, it's remembered as something permanent. That tells you a lot about how memory works. We remember outcomes more than processes. Symbols more than systems. Finished-looking things more than the endless labor behind them. So the Great Wall survives in the imagination as a completed idea, even though it never really was one. As we approach the quiet end of our story, there's one last thing worth noticing. The wall didn't just shape China's relationship with the outside world. It shaped how China explained itself to itself. It offered a story of continuity, of defense, of endurance under pressure. Those stories matter. Not because they're perfectly accurate, but because they help people make sense of long, complicated histories that don't fit neatly into timelines. The Great Wall became a shorthand, a way to say, "We have been here a long time, and we have dealt with difficulty before." And honestly, that's not nothing. So now, as the wall stretches off into the dark one last time, uneven and unfinished, we can let it rest. Not as a miracle, not as a mistake, just as what it's always been. A very long answer to a very old question. You can let your thoughts slow down now. Let the stones blur together. There's only silence ahead. Part 9. Letting the wall be quiet, finally. Alright. This is the part where we don't really add anything new. We just stay for a minute. Because after all the dynasties, all the labor, all the symbolism layered on top like historical sediment, the Great Wall eventually reaches a point where it doesn't need interpretation anymore. Just needs silence. If you imagine the wall at dawn, not the postcard dawn, not the dramatic one, but the plain, pale kind where colors haven't fully decided what they're doing yet, it doesn't look powerful. Doesn't look weak either. It looks patient. The stones don't announce themselves. The towers don't demand attention. They simply remain where they were left, holding the shape of decisions made by people who never expected to be remembered this way. That's one of the quieter truths about the wall. No one who built it imagined tourists. No one thought about legacy in the modern sense. They were responding to immediate needs. Orders, fear, routine, survival. And somehow that ordinary motivation turned into something extraordinary. Not because it succeeded perfectly, but because it kept being there. The wall outlasted its usefulness. Then it outlasted its builders. Then it outlasted the reasons anyone remembered why it was there in the first place. What remained was shape. And humans are very good at filling shapes with meaning. So we filled it with nationalism, with pride, with lessons, with metaphors about strength and weakness and identity. But the wall itself never confirms any of that. Doesn't push back. Doesn't explain. It doesn't clarify misunderstandings that have been repeated for generations. It lets us believe whatever helps us sleep. Which honestly feels appropriate for a bedtime story. Because if there's one thing the Great Wall teaches without trying to, it's that history doesn't need to be loud to be heavy. It doesn't need climactic moments or dramatic endings. Sometimes it's just accumulation. One decision stacked on another. One repair following another. One century quietly leaning into the next. And eventually, the story becomes too big to hold all at once, so we simplify it. We smooth it out. We pick a version that feels manageable. That's not dishonesty. That's survival. So as we finally step away, really step away this time, there's no moral to underline. No call to action. No clever takeaway. Just a long wall, stretching across hills and deserts. Doing what it has always done best. Existing. You don't need to remember dates. You don't need to remember names. You don't even need to remember this story. The wall doesn't mind. It will still be there. Even. Quiet. And completely uninterested in whether we understood it correctly. You can let go now. Let the last stones fade into the dark. That's the end of the road. Part 10. Staying a little longer because history doesn't rush you out. Alright. We're technically past the ending now. But that's fine. The Great Wall has always had extra length no one planned for. This is the part where nothing really happens. And that's intentional. Because after everything, emperors pacing halls, laborers tamping earth, soldiers staring into wind, what the wall mostly experienced was time passing without incident. Long afternoons. Cold mornings. Evenings where nothing crossed the horizon. That quiet made up the majority of its existence. If you listen closely, that's the rhythm the wall keeps. Not conquest. Not failure. Just duration. Stone warming in the sun. Stone cooling at night. Wind doing small repetitive work. Grass insisting on growing between bricks no matter how many times it's cleared away. This is the part of history we don't usually record. No chronicles mention the day nothing happened. No inscriptions celebrate a week without raids. No monuments honor boredom. But boredom is where most lives actually happen. For the soldiers it was waiting. For the villagers it was routine. For the wall itself, it was simply standing where it had been told to stand. And standing is a strangely demanding task when you do it for centuries. So if you're still listening or half listening, let that sameness sink in. Let the repetition smooth things out. History doesn't need to entertain you to be meaningful. Sometimes it just needs to be present. The Great Wall was present. Over and over again. And now so are you. Just here. Just breathing. No lesson. No urgency. Only the sense that something very old once tried very hard to matter. And ended up mattering in ways no one planned. That's a good place to rest. We don't need another part after this. But if we had one, it would sound exactly like this. Quiet. Part 11. The wall as a witness, and nothing else. Alright. If you're still with me, this is the final stretch. We're not adding drama. We're not inventing meaning. We're just observing. Because after thousands of years, that's what the Great Wall has become. A witness. It has seen empires rise and fall. Soldiers born, live and die. Families come and go. Trade flourish and collapse. Winds howl. Snow falls. Sun scorches. Rain seeps into the cracks. And through it all, the wall has done nothing but remain. It doesn't intervene. It doesn't judge. It doesn't care. Even when people tried to claim it as a symbol of strength, unity, identity, the wall only listened silently, passively in its own way. This is important, because most histories want action. They want battles. They want clever rulers or mistakes that change the course of nations. They want events you can summarize in a sentence or two. The wall doesn't offer that. It offers presence. A line across mountains and deserts, as indifferent to your interpretation as it is to the erosion beneath its base. Doesn't promise protection. Doesn't promise success. Doesn't promise understanding. And maybe that's why it endures. Not because it was perfect. Not because it was clever. Not because it ever stopped anyone who wanted to cross. But because it exists. And because humans keep coming back to it, noticing it, walking it, photographing it, trying to make sense of it. The wall is a story told backwards. We assign meaning. We reconstruct effort. We imagine purpose. And all it does is stay there. So, if your eyes are closing slowly, that's perfect. The wall doesn't mind. It has waited far longer than we have. Its lesson is subtle. It is patient. It is quiet. And in that quiet you can finally let go. The Great Wall will still be there tomorrow. And the next day. And centuries from now. Completely uninterested in whether anyone is watching. Completely uninterested in whether anyone remembers why it was built. Just present. Just enduring. Just existing. And that is, in its own way, enough.